The courtroom smelled like old paper and expensive perfume. I noticed the paper first, that dry, slightly bitter scent that I'd lived with for 38 years behind the reference desk at the Charleston County Library. It was the smell of records, of history, of things written down so they couldn't be erased. The perfume came from the table across the aisle. Chanel. My daughter-in-law, Brianna, always wore Chanel No. 5, even to funerals. She wore it the day we buried Harold 6 years ago, and I remember thinking even then that a woman who chooses her perfume for a burial is a woman who plans every breath she takes. I sat up straight on the oak bench, the way my mother taught me to sit in church. My hands rested on the brown leather handbag in my lap, the same handbag Harold gave me for our 40th anniversary, now worn soft at the corners from 45 years of carrying everything that mattered. Inside that handbag, my fingers found the cream-colored envelope. Nobody in this courtroom knew it existed. Not my son Damon, sitting 30 feet away in his $5,000 suit, whispering to his attorney. Not Brianna, seated behind him, tapping her pen against a leather notebook like she was keeping score. Not even Judge Eleanor Whitmore, who had not yet entered the chamber. Only I knew. And Harold. Harold had known for 6 years, from a grave just off Highway 17, where I still brought yellow roses on the first Sunday of every month. My son's attorney, a polished white man named Preston Caldwell, laughed at something Damon said. A low, confident laugh. The laugh of a man who thought he already knew how the day would end. I watched them without letting my face show anything. My grandmother taught me that. Clara Bell, she used to say, a black woman in America keeps 2 faces, the one she gives the world and the one she keeps for God. Don't ever mix them up. The bailiff called us to rise. Judge Whitmore entered, a tall, silver-haired woman with reading glasses on a chain. Her eyes swept the room once, quickly, and paused on me for maybe half a second longer than on anyone else. I couldn't tell what that meant. I hoped it meant she saw me, not the story Damon had written about me. Me. I took one slow breath, and I thought, I'm not afraid anymore. I buried Harold 6 years ago, but today I'm bringing him back into this room, and my son has no idea what's coming. My name is Clara Washington, and before I tell you how I ended up suing my only child, I have to tell you who I was before he decided I was nothing. I was born on Johns Island, South Carolina, in 1958, in a wooden house that my great-grandfather built with his own hands after emancipation. My people are Gullah Geechee, descendants of West Africans who were brought to these sea islands in chains and who, by some miracle of stubbornness and faith, held on to our language and our songs when everything else was taken. My grandmother Ruthie couldn't read a word of English, but she could recite Psalm 23 in Gullah in English, and in the old tongue her mother brought across the water. When I was 6 years old, Grandma Ruthie took me to a library in downtown Charleston. The white librarian looked up, looked at us, and said, "Colored folks aren't allowed inside." My grandmother didn't argue. She just took my hand and walked me home. But that night, she sat me on her lap and said, "Clara, one day they're going to let you in, and when they do, you learn every word in that building. You hear me? Words are the one thing they can't take back once they're written down." I was 14 when the Charleston County Library integrated. I walked in on a Tuesday afternoon in August 1972, and I never really walked out. I got my master's in library science from the University of South Carolina in 1981, one of 4 black women in my program. I came back to Charleston and took a job as an assistant librarian. By 1995, I was head of the African American Historical Archives Department. I stayed there until I retired in 2019. 38 years, hundreds of thousands of documents, and every single one of them taught me the same lesson my grandmother had taught me on her front porch. Paper outlives pain. Harold used to tease me about it. He'd come home from his job as a federal auditor, and he'd find me at the kitchen table with one of my brown leather notebooks, writing everything down. Grocery lists, phone conversations, what the weather did on a Tuesday, what the pastor preached about on Sunday. "Clara Bear," he'd say, shaking his head. "My wife doesn't trust her memory. She only trusts ink." I'd laugh and say, "Harold, memory is a liar. Ink is a witness." He didn't know then how right I was going to need to be. Harold and I had one child. Just the one. I had 2 miscarriages before Damon came, and after he was born, the doctors told me I wouldn't have any more. So we poured everything we had into that boy. Everything. I want you to understand something, because this is the part of the story that still makes my chest hurt when I tell it. Damon was a beautiful child. He really was. Smart. Scary smart. He read at 3 years old. By 6, he was correcting the other kids' grammar on the playground, and I had to sit him down and explain that being right didn't give him permission to be cruel. When Damon was 8, a boy at school called him a name I won't repeat. Damon came home crying so hard his chest was heaving. I didn't tell him to ignore it. I didn't tell him to fight. I took his hand and I drove him to the library, and I pulled out everything I could find on Thurgood Marshall, Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells. I sat him in a study carrel and I said, "Son, listen to me. Our people survived because we documented everything. Every lynching, every land theft, every broken promise. We wrote it down. And one day the writing was enough. Marshall went to the Supreme Court with paper. Douglass escaped slavery with a book. When the world tells you you're nothing, you answer with words. You hear me?" He nodded, 8 years old, tears still on his face. And he said, "Mama, I want to be a lawyer." Harold and I put everything into making that happen. We mortgaged our house on Ashley Avenue, the house Harold had bought in 1978 for $32,000, the house where I still live, so Damon could go to Morehouse College, then Harvard Law. He graduated in 2008 and took a job at a corporate firm in Atlanta. He came home less and less after that. The last time we had a real conversation, a real one, where my son looked me in the eye, was at Harold's funeral in February 2020. Damon flew in the night before. He stood beside me at the graveside in Mount Pleasant, and he held my hand for exactly 11 minutes. I counted because I didn't want to forget what the last time felt like. 2 days later, he was back in Atlanta. The phone calls got shorter. Then they came only on holidays, then only on my birthday. Then Brianna started answering instead of him. "Mama Clara, Damon's in a meeting. He asked me to check on you." "Mama Clara, the boys have soccer. We can't make it down for Christmas." "Mama Clara, have you thought about moving to a smaller place? That big house has to be hard on you." I told myself he was busy. That's what mothers do. We tell ourselves stories that let us keep loving our children, because the alternative is too much to carry. I told myself he was busy for 4 years, until March. It was a Tuesday, the 18th of March, 2024, and I was putting a load of laundry into the dryer when the phone rang. The landline. Harold and I never got rid of it, and I never saw a reason to either. I picked up. "Mrs. Washington, this is Denise at Wells Fargo on King Street. I'm calling because we have a transfer request that requires your verbal authorization. Can you confirm your intent to transfer the deed of 1247 Ashley Avenue to an entity called BWB Holdings, LLC? I stood there holding a wet towel. I said, "Ma'am, I don't know what you're talking about." There was a pause on the other end. "Mrs. Washington, are you saying you did not initiate this transfer?" "I'm saying I have lived in this house for 46 years, and nobody is taking the deed anywhere." She asked me to come in. I drove down to the branch with Harold's old ledger under my arm, because when something feels wrong, you bring paper. Denise took me into a back office, closed the door, and pulled up my file. What she showed me took the air out of my body. My son had filed a petition for conservatorship of me in Charleston County. That's the legal process where someone asks a court to declare an adult mentally incompetent so another adult can manage their affairs, their money, their home, their medical decisions, everything. The petition claimed I was suffering from early-stage dementia. It had been filed 3 weeks earlier. I had never been served because the paperwork had been sent to an address in Atlanta. Damon's address, listed as my current residence. Attached was a signed medical evaluation from a psychiatrist named Dr. Raymond Caldwell. The evaluation stated that I was cognitively impaired, unable to manage my own financial affairs, and likely to benefit from the supervised care of my son. I had never heard the name Dr. Raymond Caldwell in my life. While the conservatorship petition was pending, all accounts in Harold's name, including the retirement fund he'd left me, $487,000 that was supposed to carry me through my old age, had been frozen. Quote, "Pending resolution," and a new entity called BWB Holdings, LLC, had been created in Georgia, with Brianna, Damon, and Brianna's mother, Yolanda Brooks, as the 3 members. BWB, Brianna, Washington, Brooks. They had filed paperwork to transfer my house. The house Harold bought, the house I raised my son in, the house on Ashley Avenue with the loose floorboard by the kitchen and the dogwood tree Harold planted the spring Damon was born, into BWB Holdings. The current market value was $890,000. I sat in Denise's office for a long time without saying anything. She brought me a plastic cup of water. I didn't drink it. Finally, I said, "Denise, are you telling me that my son is trying to have me declared senile so he can take my house?" She wouldn't look at me when she answered. "Mrs. Washington, I can't give you legal advice, but I can tell you the paperwork is real, and I can tell you that from everything I'm hearing you say to me right now, you are not what that medical report says you are." I drove home. I sat on the porch swing Harold built in 1984, and I did not cry. I didn't cry because crying was for later. What I needed to do right then was think. I tried to call Damon 11 times over the next 6 days. The first 3 he didn't answer. The next 4, the phone went straight to voicemail. On the 8th call, the phone rang twice and disconnected, which meant he was sending me to voicemail on purpose. The 9th and 10th, the same thing. On the 12th call, Brianna picked up. "Mama Clara." Her voice had that soft, sorry tone people use with children and the dying. "Damon can't come to the phone. He's in court all week." I said, "Brianna, I went to Wells Fargo. I saw the petition." There was a pause, only half a second. But I've been reading pauses for 45 years of marriage and 38 years of reference desk work, and that pause told me everything. She was not surprised. "Mama Clara," softer now, almost a whisper. "We were going to talk to you this weekend. Damon was planning to fly down. This is all for your benefit. You know that, right? You're getting older. The house is too much. The finances are too much. We just want you to be safe. We love you." I held the phone for a moment. Then I said, "Brianna, let me ask you one question. The doctor who signed that evaluation, did I ever meet him?" She said, "Mama, please don't get upset. The details aren't important." I said, "Brianna, did I meet that doctor? Yes or no?" She hung up. That was the moment I understood. My son was not busy. My son was not distant. My son had decided, sometime between Harold's funeral and now, that I was an asset to be harvested. And his wife had helped him plan it. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table and I opened a fresh brown leather notebook. I keep a stack of them in the pantry next to the flour. And on the first page I wrote, March 26, 2024, 11:47 p.m. My son is trying to take my house and declare me incompetent. I am not incompetent. I am not going anywhere. I am going to keep a record of every single thing that happens from this day forward. In the name of my grandmother Ruthie, who never learned to read, and my husband Harold, who taught me that ink is a witness, I will not be erased. Then I stood up, walked down the hall to the bedroom, and I opened the safe in the closet. Harold had set up that safe the year before he died. He'd given me the combination and told me, "Clara Bear, there are 3 folders in here. One is the will. One is the insurance. The third one is for if something happens that you don't expect. You'll know when to open it. Don't open it until then." In 6 years, I had never opened the third folder. I opened it that night. Inside was a handwritten letter, dated December 3rd, 2019, 2 months before Harold died. I recognized his careful, slanted handwriting immediately, and the first line of that letter stopped my breath. "Clara Bear, if you're reading this because of Damon, I'm so sorry. I saw it in him when he was 30. I hoped I was wrong. Go to First Citizens Bank on Meeting Street. Safety Deposit Box 318. The key is taped to the back of my father's photograph. Tell no one, not even Damon. Especially not Damon. I love you more than my life, and I didn't want to leave you without a weapon. Your husband, always, H." I held that letter in my hands, sitting on the edge of the bed Harold and I had shared for 45 years. And for the first time since Denise at Wells Fargo had pulled up that petition, I started to cry. Not because I was afraid, because I wasn't alone. The next morning I did 3 things, in this order. First, I called my niece, Nia Jackson, my sister Gloria's daughter. Nia is 28, a registered nurse at MUSC, and the only person in our family under 40 who still calls me Auntie Clara instead of just Clara. I asked her to come over that evening. I didn't tell her why. I just said, "Baby, I need you. Bring dinner from Bertha's if you can." Second, I called Reverend Samuel Hayes, the pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church, where Harold and I got married in 1979 and where Harold's funeral was held. Sam had been Harold's best friend since they were in 3rd grade together. I said, "Sam, I need a lawyer. Not one of ours. Not church folks, not family friends. I need somebody sharp who handles elder abuse. And I don't want a white lawyer. I want somebody who understands what this is." Sam was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Clara, what has that boy done?" I said, "He's trying to bury me while I'm still breathing." Sam didn't ask another question. He just said, "Gwen Thompson, King Street. I'll call her tonight." Third, and this was the hardest thing, I called my bank. Not Wells Fargo, a different bank. First Citizens on Meeting Street. I asked if I could come in that afternoon to access a safety deposit box in my husband's name. The young woman on the phone confirmed that as the surviving spouse with documentation, yes, I could. I drove to First Citizens at 2 o'clock. I brought Harold's death certificate, our marriage license, my driver's license, and the little brass key that had been taped to the back of Harold's father's photograph for who knows how long. The clerk led me into a small private room with gray walls and a single fluorescent light. She set the long metal box in front of me, and she closed the door behind her when she left. I sat there alone for a full minute before I could bring myself to open it. Inside the box was one cream-colored envelope, and underneath the envelope, taped to the bottom of the box so you wouldn't see it unless you reached inside, was a small black USB drive. I took both. I signed the exit slip. I walked out to my car in the parking garage, and I sat in the driver's seat holding the envelope in my lap. I didn't open it there. I wanted to be home. I wanted to be in the kitchen, at the table where Harold and I had eaten 30,000 meals together, with one of my brown notebooks open beside me, because whatever was inside this envelope, I was going to write it down. Nia came over at 6:30. She had cornbread and collard greens from Bertha's kitchen, and she had tears in her eyes before I'd said a word. "Auntie Clara," she said, "Brianna called me last week." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. "Tell me." Nia took a breath. "She offered me $15,000 to sign a statement saying you'd been confused lately, saying you'd forgotten appointments, saying I'd been worried about your memory." I closed my eyes. "Auntie Clara, I didn't do it. I told her no. I told her you were sharper than anybody in this family. And then last week she took the kids off the family group chat. Damon's kids. I can't see pictures of them anymore. They cut me off." My hands stayed very still on the kitchen table. I said, "Nia, when she called you, did you record it?" She looked up at me and her eyes got big. "Auntie, I did. I didn't even think about it at the time. Nursing school teaches you, when something feels off, document it. I always hit record when somebody calls asking me weird questions. It's on my phone." I reached across the table and I took her hand. "Baby girl," I said, "in the state of South Carolina, you only need one person's consent to record a phone call. You know what that means?" She shook her head. "It means that recording is evidence, and evidence is admissible in court." Nia started crying then, not loud, just a few tears that slid down her face and onto the back of my hand. She said, "Auntie, what are you going to do? I thought about Grandma Ruthie, walking me out of that whites-only library in 1964. I thought about Harold, dying of cancer but still reaching forward into a future he wouldn't see to protect me. I thought about my son somewhere in Atlanta, signing papers that called his own mother senile. I said, 'Nia, I'm going to take my son to court, and I am going to win.'" Gwendolyn Thompson's law office was on the 3rd floor of a narrow brick building on King Street, above a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and burnt sugar. I remember that smell because I walked up those stairs 3 times a week for 6 weeks, and every time, the cinnamon reminded me of my mother's kitchen. Gwen was 55 years old, tall, dark-skinned, with her hair twisted into neat gray locks that fell past her shoulders. She wore a plain navy suit and no jewelry except a thin gold band on her right hand. Not a wedding ring, but something her mother had left her, I learned later. Her office was simple: a heavy wooden desk, 2 leather chairs, 1 small window, and 3 entire walls of books. Legal books, civil rights history, a first edition copy of The Souls of Black Folk Behind Glass. The first thing she said to me when Reverend Hayes and I sat down in those leather chairs was, "Mrs. Washington, before we begin, I need to tell you something. I handle about 30 cases of elder financial abuse every year. Most of them are settled quietly. The families don't want the shame. The victims don't want the fight. Your son filed for permanent conservatorship. Not temporary, not limited, permanent. That means he wanted total control of you. I need you to tell me right now why you think he went that far." I looked at her. I looked at Sam. Then I looked back at her. I said because he thought I was already gone. He thought Harold took everything important with him when he died. He thought what was left was just an old woman in a big house who wouldn't notice if the walls disappeared around her. Gwen nodded slowly. "And what did he miss?" "He missed that I'm a librarian. I notice when things disappear. It's my job." For the first time since I'd sat down, Gwen smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. "Mrs. Washington," she said, "I think we're going to do just fine." Over the next 6 weeks, Gwen built a case. I brought her every notebook I'd kept for the past 5 years, 23 of them, stacked in a cardboard box Harold used to store Christmas ornaments in. I brought her Harold's letter. I brought her the USB drive, which we didn't open in her office, but which she had a forensic expert verify and preserve. I brought her Nia's recording. I also brought her something Gwen hadn't asked for, but which I think convinced her that this case was bigger than my son. I brought her a list, written in my own hand, of every time in the past 4 years that Brianna had said something to me that in retrospect was not a casual comment, but a test. "Mama Clara, did you take your medication today?" April 2022. I didn't take any medication besides blood pressure pills. "Mama Clara, do you remember my sister's name?" August 2022. Brianna doesn't have a sister. "Mama Clara, you called me twice about the same thing this morning. Are you feeling all right?" November 2022. I had called her one time. She told me I had called twice, page after page of it. 4 years of slow, patient planting, Brianna preparing the ground. Preparing the story she would eventually tell a court. Gwen read that list and set it down on her desk very carefully. She said, "Mrs. Washington, your daughter-in-law is not an amateur. She has done this before, or she has studied somebody who has. We need to pull thread on her background." I didn't know yet how right she was. 2 weeks before the trial, Brianna called me. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was outside cutting back the azaleas. I almost didn't answer, but Gwen had told me, "Record every contact. Don't refuse any call. Let them say things." So I went inside, wiped my hands, and picked up. "Mama Clara," that soft, patient voice. "I think we can end this without the ugliness of a courtroom. Damon is willing to drop the petition entirely. You can keep the house. We'll release the accounts. All we're asking is that you sign a waiver releasing us from any future legal action, and that you move into a senior community. There's a lovely one in Mount Pleasant with a waiting list, but Damon's firm has contacts." I let her finish. Then I said, "Brianna, let me ask you a question, and I want the truth. The doctor, Dr. Caldwell, how did you find him?" She said, "Mama, that's not important anymore." I said, "Brianna, how did you find him?" There was a pause. Then she said in a voice I'd never heard from her before, flatter, colder, the real voice underneath the soft one, "You don't want to go to court, Clara. Old black women don't win in court in South Carolina. Judges send them to homes. They think they're doing them a favor." And then, very quietly, she said something I will remember until the day I die. "You're a burden, Clara. You've been a burden since Harold died. Damon is just the one with the courage to do something about it." She hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that call. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I didn't even sit down. I walked to the cabinet, took down a fresh brown notebook, opened it to the first page, and I wrote, April 9th, 2026, 2:47 p.m. Brianna Washington called me a burden. She said old black women don't win in court in South Carolina. She is wrong. I will show her how wrong. Then I called Gwen. She tried to settle. They said. Gwen said, "What did you tell her?" I said, "I didn't have to tell her anything. She told me who she is." The night before the trial, I couldn't sleep. I sat up in bed at 2 in the morning, and I called the only person I thought could understand what I was about to walk into. I called Reverend Hayes. Sam answered on the second ring, wide awake, the way preachers always are. "Clara, you scared?" "No, Sam, I'm awake." He laughed softly. "Those are the same thing sometimes." We talked for 40 minutes. He didn't pray with me. He didn't tell me scripture. He just talked to me about Harold, about the summer the two of them built a treehouse for Damon in 1989, and how Harold spent 3 whole weekends on it, and how Damon played in it maybe twice before getting bored. He talked about how Harold told him once, around 2018, "Sam, I love my boy, but I don't know him anymore. He doesn't come home. He doesn't call. Brianna's changed him, and I can see it. I can see it, and I don't know what to do. I said, Sam? He knew. Harold knew, and he didn't tell me. Sam was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Clara, he didn't tell you because he couldn't bear to break your heart while he was still alive to see it. But he made sure that when the day came, you wouldn't be unarmed. That's not hiding from you. That's loving you. I hung up the phone at 2:40 in the morning, and I slept for exactly 3 hours. At 5:30, I got up. I put on the navy blue suit Harold bought me for my last birthday before he died. I fastened my mother's pearls around my neck, and I stepped into the shoes I'd polished the night before. I looked at myself in the mirror. I was 68 years old. My hair was all the way silver now. There were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there when Harold died. But I want to say this the right way. I looked like somebody. I looked like my grandmother Ruthie, who walked out of a library in 1964 holding her head up even when they told her she wasn't welcome. I looked like my mother, who cleaned houses in South of Broad for 30 years and never once bent her back to anyone. I looked like a woman who had buried her husband, raised her son, kept the records, and come this far on her own 2 feet. I drove the Buick to the Charleston County Courthouse alone. I parked in the public lot. I got out of the car, and as I was closing the door, I looked up and saw a black Mercedes pulling into the spot 3 cars away. Damon got out first. He saw me. He stopped, just for a second, and something passed across his face that I couldn't read. Sorrow, maybe, or shame, or just surprise at seeing me standing upright on a Wednesday morning at 8:15 a.m., showing up to fight for my own life. Then Brianna got out of the passenger side, and she took his arm, and whatever I'd seen in his face closed up like a door. He turned away first. I walked into the courthouse with my handbag in one hand, my mother's pearls at my throat, and Harold's envelope sitting against my hip. Preston Caldwell rose first. He was an attractive, sandy-haired man in his mid-40s, the kind of lawyer whose watch costs more than most people's cars. His opening statement was smooth, almost gentle. He didn't sound like he was attacking me. He sounded like he was pitying me. Your Honor, he said, this is a sad case. A case of a devoted son who has watched from a distance as his mother's cognitive faculties have slowly declined since the death of her beloved husband 6 years ago. Damon Washington is not here to take anything from his mother. He is here because he loves her and because he has watched her fall behind on her utilities, miss appointments, and grow confused in public settings. The medical evaluation before the court is clear. Mrs. Washington needs help. Her son is simply trying to provide it, in the most legally protective way he knows how. Every word was designed to make me small. I sat beside Gwen at the plaintiff's table. I didn't react. Gwen put her hand over mine briefly and whispered, "Let him build it. The higher the wall, the louder it falls." Caldwell called 3 witnesses that morning. The first was a woman named Mrs. Eileen Patterson, a neighbor from 2 streets over who had moved into the neighborhood only 8 months earlier. She testified that she had seen me wandering, appearing disoriented in the Piggly Wiggly on Folly Road back in January. Gwen rose to cross-examine. "Mrs. Patterson, how long have you lived in the neighborhood?" "About 8 months. Prior to January, had you ever had a conversation with Mrs. Washington lasting more than 2 minutes?" Not really, no." "So when you saw Mrs. Washington in the Piggly Wiggly, you had no baseline understanding of her normal behavior, correct?" I suppose that's true." "Mrs. Patterson, are you aware that on that day in January, a 4-year-old child had become separated from her mother in the store, and that Mrs. Washington was walking the aisles with that child, holding her hand and calling for the mother?" Silence. "Mrs. Patterson?" I didn't know that. No further questions. The second witness was Dr. Raymond Caldwell. Yes, Preston's own brother. A fact Gwen flagged for the judge immediately. Dr. Caldwell testified that he had evaluated me and found evidence of early-stage dementia. Gwen's cross-examination was surgical. "Dr. Caldwell, how long was your evaluation of Mrs. Washington?" "Approximately 45 minutes. Was this an in-person evaluation?" A pause. "It was a telehealth consultation." "A video call." "Yes." "Who scheduled this consultation?" "The patient's son." "Dr. Caldwell, did Mrs. Washington know you were evaluating her for a potential dementia diagnosis?" The The consultation was described to her as a general wellness check. So you diagnosed a woman with early-stage dementia based on a 45-minute video call during which she did not know she was being evaluated for cognitive impairment. The doctor said nothing. Dr. Caldwell, are you aware that your brother Preston Caldwell is representing Damon Washington in this matter? I'm aware. Did your brother recommend you to Mr. Washington? I believe so. No further questions, Your Honor. The courtroom was very quiet. The third witness was Damon. I want to tell you what it was like to watch my only child walk to that witness stand, raise his right hand, and swear to tell the truth in order to take my house from me. I want to tell you, but I'm not sure I have the words. He didn't look at me. Not once. Not when he walked past our table. Not when he sat down. Not when Preston asked him to describe his concerns about his mother's condition. Damon said I had been calling his father's name aloud in empty rooms. I hadn't. I had once said, Harold would have laughed at this, at a family dinner, a common thing widows say about their dead husbands. Brianna was there. She heard it. Damon said I had forgotten his birthday the previous year. I had sent him a card. I had the stub from the post office receipt. Damon said he had tried to discuss his concerns with me directly, but I had refused to listen. He had not called me in 7 months before he filed the petition. And Damon said at the end of his direct testimony, Your Honor, I love my mother. This is the hardest thing I've ever done. But she needs help, and she can't see it herself. That's what dementia does. It hides from the person who has it. Gwen stood up to cross-examine. She looked at Damon for a long moment before she said anything. Then she said gently, almost kindly, Mr. Washington, we'll return to you this afternoon. I have some documents I'd like you to review first, over the lunch break. No further questions at this time. Judge Whitmore called recess for lunch. Gwen and I ate sandwiches in a small conference room down the hall. She didn't eat much. Neither did I. She opened her laptop, and she turned the screen toward me. Mrs. Washington, are you ready to look at what's on your husband's drive? I said, I watched it last night. 3 times. She looked at me. I know. You told me. But I need to know. Are you ready to see your son watch it? I took a long breath. I thought about Harold, writing that letter in December 2019, knowing he had maybe 2 months left to live, knowing he was sealing something in a safety deposit box that his own wife might need to open against their own son. I said, Yes, I'm ready. We came back from recess at 1:30 p.m. My first witness was Nia. She walked in wearing her scrubs. She had come directly from a night shift at MUSC, only 2 hours of sleep. She didn't seem tired. She seemed ready. She raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat down with her back very straight. Gwen asked her to describe her relationship with me. Nia said she saw me every week, sometimes twice. She said I managed my own medication, blood pressure pills, a baby aspirin, vitamin D. She said I drove myself, cooked, kept my own finances, read 2 novels a month, and had never, not once in 3 years, forgotten her name or asked her a repeating question. Then Gwen asked, Ms. Jackson, did you receive a phone call on January 12th of this year from Brianna Washington? Yes. Did Mrs. Washington, the younger Mrs. Washington, make you a financial offer during that call? Yes. In what amount? $15,000. In exchange for what? She asked me to sign a statement saying my aunt had become forgetful and confused. She said I wouldn't be lying, quote, because old people forget things anyway. Preston Caldwell stood up. Objection. Hearsay. Gwen said calmly, Your Honor, the statement is not hearsay. I have it on a recording. The courtroom went still. Preston said, Objection. That recording was not... Judge Whitmore looked at him over her glasses. Mr. Caldwell, South Carolina is a one-party consent state. If Ms. Jackson was party to the call, she had every right to record it. The recording is admissible. Play it. Gwen pressed play. Brianna's voice filled the courtroom. Clear. Unmistakable. Her Chanel perfume voice. Nia, honey, Mama Clara is a burden. We can make this easy for everyone. 15,000 and you just say she forgets things. It's not even a lie. Old people forget. I did not look at my son. I looked at Brianna. She had gone very, very still at the defense table. Her hand had stopped tapping her pen. Her eyes were fixed on a point on the wall behind the judge. Judge Whitmore made a small sound, not quite a word, and wrote something in her notes. That was the first climax, not because of the recording itself, but because of what I realized. Sitting there, my daughter-in-law had called me a burden to my own niece. She had called me a burden while offering to buy a lie about my mind. And she had not thought, not for 1 second, that a black woman in her 20s, working nights at a hospital, might have the instinct to press record. My people have been pressing record, in one form or another, for 400 years. Next, Gwen moved to introduce the contents of Harold's USB drive into evidence. She walked the court through what was on it. She was careful. She was precise. She laid the foundation, as lawyers say. Harold Washington had been a federal auditor for the Department of Treasury for 31 years. He had kept meticulous records, not only for his job, but at home. Between 2018 and 2019, Harold had, through a shared family email account that Damon had used during college and never fully closed, inadvertently received forwarded copies of private correspondence between Damon and Brianna. He had saved them. All of them. The first email was dated March 14th, 2019. From Brianna to Damon. Gwen read it aloud into the record. Babe, I was thinking. Your parents' house in Charleston is probably worth close to $1 million by now. When your dad goes, and I hate to say it, but he won't last another year with that diagnosis, we need to move fast on your mom. Elderly black women in the South, the judges default to family control almost every time. There are doctors who do telehealth evaluations. I've already looked into it. A soft murmur moved through the courtroom. The second email, dated February 24th, 2020, 13 days after Harold's funeral. Start planting seeds. Say she forgets things. Say she repeats herself. Say you're worried. Do it slowly. 3 years from now, we'll have everything. Damon's face had lost all its color. The third document was a legal consultation memo, dated May of 2019. Harold had gone quietly to a lawyer in Charleston, an elder law specialist, and asked about how to protect his wife from a future conservatorship attempt by their son. The memo described the legal strategy Harold was advised to pursue: a documented paper trail, independent medical records showing cognitive capacity, and a designated elder law attorney to contact in the event of filing. The name of that lawyer, the one Harold had consulted in 2019? Gwen turned to the court and said, Your Honor, for the record, the attorney Mr. Washington consulted in 2019 was attorney Nathaniel Thompson of Charleston, South Carolina, who was my father. That was the second climax. I hadn't known either. Not until Gwen told me, the week before trial, after she'd done her own research into Harold's history. Her father had passed away in 2022. He had never mentioned the consultation, but he had kept his files, and Gwen had found a single folder labeled simply Washington H, 2019, in the back of a cabinet in her mother's garage. Harold hadn't just left me weapons. He had left me allies I didn't know were waiting. Gwen was one of them, and she hadn't known it until she took my case. I looked at my son then. I couldn't help it. Damon was looking at me, really looking, for the first time all day. His eyes were wet. His mouth was slightly open like he wanted to say something, and then it closed. He looked away. I felt nothing. That was the strangest part. I had expected, for 6 weeks I had expected, that I would feel triumphant in this moment, or vindicated, or furious. Instead, I felt the thing I remember feeling after Harold died, a quiet, cold, clean kind of sorrow. The sorrow of losing something you've already lost a long time ago, and only just now understanding it. Gwen looked at me. She raised one eyebrow slightly. A question. Are you ready to testify? I nodded. I walked to the witness stand the way my grandmother taught me to walk into any room where white folks might be watching. Slow, upright, eyes level. I had been 68 years in this body, and it carried me across the courtroom floor without a single tremor. I set my brown leather notebook on the wooden ledge in front of me, not the one I was currently keeping. That one stayed in my handbag. This notebook was older. I had chosen it carefully the night before. It was the one I began on February 13th, 2020. Muddy, the morning after Harold's funeral. The first page, in my own handwriting, read, Harold is gone. I will keep writing. That is what he would want. I swore on the Bible the bailiff held out to me. My left hand rested on that old notebook as I did. Gwen approached. Mrs. Washington, she said, for the record, can you state your full name, your age, and your occupation? Clara May Washington, 68 years old, retired head librarian of African American Historical Archives at the Charleston County Library. I served in that position for 24 years, and I worked in that library for 38. Mrs. Washington, can you tell the court what today's date is? Today is Wednesday, April 22nd, 2026. We're in Charleston County Courthouse. Your Honor, Judge Eleanor Whitmore is presiding. The case number is CW-2026-0417. My son is suing me for conservatorship. I am defending my right to remain a free citizen of the state of South Carolina. Judge Whitmore, I noticed, had set her pen down. She was simply listening. Gwen asked me a few more foundational questions about my daily routine, my financial management, my medical history. I answered each one clearly. I didn't rush. I didn't elaborate. I answered what I was asked. Then Gwen said, "No further questions, Your Honor." And Preston Caldwell stood up. He walked toward me slowly, the way a man walks toward an animal he's decided isn't as dangerous as people said. "Mrs. Washington, you've had a long day. How are you feeling?" "I'm tired, Mr. Caldwell. I imagine you are too." A small ripple of something, not quite laughter, moved through the courtroom. Caldwell's smile tightened. "Mrs. Washington, isn't it true that you sometimes forget things?" "Mr. Caldwell, I'm 68 years old. I forget where I put my reading glasses about twice a week. I don't forget who I am, and I don't forget who my husband was." "Mrs. Washington, you seem emotional today. Wouldn't you agree you're under significant stress?" "I am under significant stress. My only child is trying to have me declared incompetent so he can take my home. I would be concerned about my mental state if I were not under stress." Caldwell paused. I could see him recalibrating. "Mrs. Washington, isn't it true that you have been known to speak to your late husband as if he were still alive?" "Mr. Caldwell, have you ever lost someone you loved?" He didn't answer. "I said, have you ever lost someone you loved, Mr. Caldwell?" Judge Whitmore leaned forward slightly. She said, "The witness may answer without further question from counsel. Mrs. Washington, please proceed." I turned to the courtroom. I did not turn toward my son. I did not turn toward Brianna. I looked straight ahead, at the wooden panels on the back wall, and I spoke the way I used to speak at the reference desk when a young person came in looking for their family's history, and I had to tell them, gently, that some records had been burned, but others had been saved. I have been married to Harold Washington for 45 years. 6 of those years he has been in a grave off Highway 17. I visit him on the first Sunday of every month. I bring yellow roses, because he said once that yellow roses looked like sunshine had a sister. I sit on the grass beside his headstone, and I tell him about my week. I tell him what the azaleas are doing. I tell him what I read. Sometimes, when I'm cooking, or when something funny happens on the television, I say his name out loud in my kitchen. I say, "Harold would have laughed at this." Or I say, "Harold, can you believe what they're doing now?" I am not confused, Mr. Caldwell. I am a widow. There is a difference. And if you do not know the difference, I pray to God you never have to learn it. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Caldwell opened his mouth. He closed it. Then he said, "No further questions, Your Honor." I was not finished. I turned on the witness stand to face Judge Whitmore directly. I said, "Your Honor, may I say one more thing before I step down?" She said, "You may, Mrs. Washington." I said, "My grandmother was born in 1897 on Johns Island, South Carolina, to parents who had been born into slavery. She could not read one word of English her whole life. My mother cleaned houses in this city for 30 years. I was the first woman in my family to earn a college degree. I did it because my grandmother took me by the hand in 1964 when I was 6 years old and walked me to a library in this very city that would not let us inside. And she told me, on the front porch that evening, that one day they would let me in, and when they did, I should learn every word in that building, because words are the one thing they cannot take back once they are written down. I became a librarian, Your Honor, because of that morning. I spent 38 years of my life making sure other people's stories were preserved. My son is asking this court to say that my own story is no longer reliable, that I cannot be trusted to speak for my own life. I will not accept that, Your Honor. Not from him, not from anyone. I still have my pen, and my pen still works. I stepped down from the witness stand. I did not look at my son as I walked back to my seat. but I saw out of the corner of my eye that he had put his face in his hands. That was the third climax. Not a shout, not a breakdown. A quiet, clear statement from a black woman who had been told her whole life to be smaller, and who, at 68, had decided she was going to be exactly her own size. Judge Whitmore recessed the court for deliberation at 3:45 p.m. Gwen and I sat in this conference room down the hall. She offered me water. I drank a little. My hands, which had been steady all day, had finally begun to shake, now that the work was done. Gwen said, "However this comes out, Mrs. Washington, you did it right. You did it the way it should be done. Whatever she rules, she's going to remember you." I said, "Gwen, I need to tell you something I haven't told you." She waited. I said, "Your father. I never met him. I didn't know Harold had gone to him. I don't know what Harold told him in that meeting. But I want you to know, if your father hadn't kept that folder, and if you hadn't found it, I don't know if I would have had the strength to do this today. Your father helped save my life. I'd like to visit his grave someday, if that's all right with you." Gwen didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, then up at me. She said, "Mrs. Washington, my father died in 2022. He was 79 years old. The last case he worked on before he retired was a conservatorship case for an elderly black woman in Somerville whose sons tried to put her in a home and take her land. He won that case. And I remember because I was visiting him the week he filed the final motion. He looked at me over dinner one night and said, 'Gwenny, this is the work. This right here. Protecting our mothers and our grandmothers. This is why I went to law school.' My father would have been honored to know he was still helping you, 4 years after he was gone. I think he'd say his work wasn't wasted." I reached across the conference table, and I took her hand. We sat that way for a while. Judge Whitmore came back at 5:15 p.m. The courtroom rose. We sat. She put on her reading glasses. She looked down at her notes. Then she looked up at the defense table, at my son. "Mr. Washington, please rise." Damon rose. "Mr. Washington, this court has reviewed the petition for conservatorship filed on behalf of your mother, Clara May Washington. This court has reviewed the medical evaluation submitted by Dr. Raymond Caldwell. This court has reviewed the testimony of the witnesses called on behalf of the petitioner. And this court has reviewed the evidence presented by the respondent." She paused. "The petition for permanent conservatorship is denied in its entirety." I heard Brianna make a small sound behind him. Judge Whitmore continued, "Further, this court finds the following. First, the medical evaluation submitted in support of the petition is unreliable. Dr. Caldwell conducted a single 45-minute telehealth consultation, during which the patient was not informed she was being evaluated for cognitive impairment. Dr. Caldwell's brother is counsel of record in this matter. I am referring Dr. Caldwell's conduct to the South Carolina Board of Medical Examiners for investigation. I am further referring Attorney Preston Caldwell's conduct to the South Carolina Bar for review of professional responsibility violations." Preston Caldwell had gone very pale. Second, the financial transfers initiated to the entity BWB Holdings, LLC, including the attempted transfer of the deed to 1247 Ashley Avenue, are declared void. All accounts previously frozen under the pendency of this petition are ordered released to Mrs. Washington within 72 hours. Wells Fargo and Bank of America are ordered to comply. Third, Mr. Washington, you are ordered to reimburse your mother's legal fees in the amount of $127,400. Payment is due within 90 days. Fourth, and this is the most important finding of this court. Based on the evidence presented today, including the emails from 2019 and 2020 demonstrating a premeditated plan to obtain control of your mother's estate through the fraudulent diagnosis of a mental condition she does not have, I am referring this matter to the Office of the Ninth Circuit Solicitor for Criminal Investigation on charges of elder financial abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted grand larceny. Under South Carolina Code 433585, these are felony charges. She set down her papers. She looked at Damon directly. "Mr. Washington, you went to Harvard Law School. Your mother mortgaged her home to pay for it. Your father worked 31 years as a federal auditor to help give you that opportunity. You took the tools they gave you, and you used those tools to try to strip your mother of her house, her dignity, and her liberty. This court finds your conduct not only legally actionable, but morally contemptible. You may be seated." Damon sat. He did not look at anyone. I did not cry. I had thought for 6 weeks that I would cry when this moment came. Instead, I want to describe this carefully. I felt the way I felt on the morning Harold was first buried, sitting in the church parking lot at Mount Zion, alone in the car before anyone else had arrived. A still kind of sorrow, a clean kind of quiet. The feeling of having set down something I had been carrying for so long I had forgotten it was heavy. Gwen leaned toward me. She whispered, "Mrs. Washington, there's one more thing I have to tell you. I didn't tell you before the trial because I didn't want to distract you. My father left a sealed envelope with your name on it in the same folder where I found Harold's consultation notes. I haven't opened it. It's in my bag. Would you like it now or later?" I said, "Now, please, while I still have my courage." She took out a manila envelope and handed it to me. I opened it at the plaintiff's table, while Judge Whitmore was still seated on the bench, while the courtroom was still in that strange paused silence after a verdict. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a bank statement dated September 1st, 2019. From a credit union in North Charleston I had never heard of. The account was in my name, Clara May Washington, sole signatory. The balance, as of that date, was $342,817. Harold had opened it in 1995. I had never known about it. For 31 years, my husband had been putting money, quietly, into an account under my name, waiting for a day he hoped would never come. Under the bank statement was a note in Harold's handwriting. "Clara Bear, if you're reading this, you won. I knew you would. Spend it on something that makes you feel like yourself. I love you past the end of the world. H." That was the fourth twist. I had not cried in 6 weeks. I had not cried during Brianna's phone call, during the deposition, during the opening statements, during my own testimony, during the verdict. I cried then, quietly, at a courthouse table, with my attorney's hand on my shoulder and my husband's voice in my hands. I sat in the Buick in the courthouse parking lot for 22 minutes after Gwen said goodbye. I watched the sun go down over the magnolias by the fence. I watched the lights come on in the parking lot. I watched the last few lawyers and defendants filter out of the building. Then I picked up my phone. I called Reverend Hayes. He answered on the first ring. "Clara," I said, "Sam, it's over." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me." I told him. All of it. The ruling, the referrals, the envelope from his father, the account, Harold's note. When I was done, Sam was quiet for even longer. Then he said, "Clara, Harold loved you like a man loves the earth under his feet. I want you to remember that tonight. Not what your son did. What your husband did. That's the one you earned." I said, "Sam, I'm going to open the church tomorrow morning before service. Just for a little while. I'd like to sit in the back pew. Is that all right?" He said, "I'll leave the side door unlocked at 6. I hung up the phone. I started the Buick. I drove home down streets I had driven for 46 years, past the Piggly Wiggly where a woman had accused me of being lost while I was helping a child find her mother, past the library where I had worked for 38 years, past the dogwood tree on the corner of Ashley Avenue that was just beginning to flower for the spring. I pulled into my driveway at 7:14 p.m. I went inside. I turned on the kitchen light. I set my handbag on the table. I opened a fresh brown leather notebook. On the first page I wrote, April 22nd, 2026, 7:16 p.m. It is over. Harold, you were right. But you were also wrong. I was stronger than you feared. I only needed the truth on paper. Thank you for keeping it. I am going to bed now, and tomorrow I am going to start again. I closed the notebook. I went upstairs. I slept 11 hours for the first time since Harold died. 6 months later, the criminal case against Brianna broke wide open, and everything I thought I knew got bigger. The solicitor's office investigation turned up something Gwen had suspected, but none of us had been able to prove during our trial. Brianna Washington, born Brianna Brooks, had done this before. 10 years earlier, in Alabama, her own grandmother, an elderly black woman named Eunice Brooks, who had owned 200 acres of land outside Montgomery, had been declared incompetent after a sudden medical evaluation by a rural physician. Brianna's mother, Yolanda Brooks, had become her guardian. Within 18 months, the land had been sold. Eunice Brooks had died in a nursing home in 2017, alone, while her daughter and granddaughter lived in a new house bought with the proceeds. Brianna had not just preyed on me. She had come from a tradition of praying. She had been taught how to do this, taught specifically by her own mother, Yolanda, who had sat at Thanksgiving dinners at my kitchen table for over a decade, while quietly planning how to do to me what she had already done to her own mother. That was the fifth twist, and when I heard it, I did not feel hatred. I felt something stranger. I felt grief, a deep, tired grief, for Eunice Brooks, a woman I had never met, a woman who had died thinking nobody would ever know what had been done to her, a woman whose story had been erased, until my story, against my son and her granddaughter, brought hers back. Paper outlives pain. Brianna pled guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud and elder financial abuse. She was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. Yolanda Brooks was charged in Alabama for the case involving Eunice. That case is still ongoing. Damon accepted a plea deal, 18 months of probation, and 200 hours of community service, served at an elder advocacy center in Atlanta that handles cases just like mine. I requested that sentence specifically. The solicitor asked me if I wanted prison time for my son. I said no. I said I wanted him to sit every week for 200 hours in a room with old black women whose children had done to them what he had tried to do to me. I said let him hear their stories. Let him look at their faces. If that doesn't change him, nothing will. I have not seen Damon since the sentencing hearing. I sent him one letter about a month after the verdict. It said, "Son, I am not going to see you again in this life. I hope, when I am gone, that you will come home and sit on the porch swing your father built, and that you will remember who we tried to raise you to be. Teach your children better than I taught you." The Washington name meant something. Do not let it die in your silence. Your mother, still. C. He did not respond. I did not spend Harold's money on myself, not most of it. I used $36,000 to fix the roof and repaint the house. I used $8,000 to buy a new car, a used Toyota, nothing fancy, but the Buick was finally showing its age. I gave $25,000 to Nia to help her pay off nursing school loans. I gave $50,000 to Mount Zion Baptist Church to rebuild the fellowship hall Harold had raised money for back in 1988. The rest, most of it, $240,000, I put into a scholarship fund. The Harold Washington Memorial Scholarship provides annual grants to Black students from Charleston County who are pursuing degrees in library science, archival studies, or elder law. The first class of scholars was selected last spring. There were 4 of them, 3 young women, 1 young man. I met each of them at a ceremony in the Charleston County Library, at the very reference desk where I had stood for 38 years. Nia manages the scholarship fund now. She left MUSC last year and came to work with me. She said, "Auntie Clara, this is the work. This is what I want to do." I said, "Baby, you remind me of your grandmother. You know she'd be proud." She said, "I know." 1 year after the trial, almost to the day, the Charleston County Library hosted a small event in the community reading room on the 2nd floor. The room was full, 82 people, I was told later. Nia sat in the front row. Reverend Hayes stood against the back wall with his wife, Verna. Gwen Thompson came, wearing her mother's gold band and a dress I had never seen her in. She looked beautiful. Judge Whitmore did not come, but she sent a handwritten note that I keep pressed inside the cover of my first brown notebook. I stood at the podium in the navy suit Harold bought me for my last birthday before he died. My mother's pearls at my throat, my hair the color of an old silver spoon. I had written a book. It had taken me 10 months. The title was Paper Outlives Pain, a Librarian's Ledger. I read the opening paragraph aloud that afternoon. My voice was steady. I was 69 years old. I had buried a husband, survived a son, and written it down. All of it, I read. My son once told a courtroom I was a confused old woman. He was half right. I was old. I was not confused. I was quiet. And my people have learned over 400 years that quiet is not the same as absent. We were quiet on slave ships. We were quiet in sharecropper fields. We were quiet in segregated libraries where I was not permitted to enter until I was 14 years old. But quiet people remember everything. And sometimes quiet people write it down. I looked up at the room. I saw Nia. I saw Sam. I saw Gwen, dabbing at her eyes. I saw 4 young scholarship students in the second row, sitting up straight, listening like their lives depended on it. Because maybe one day, their lives would. I looked out at them all, and I thought of Harold, still buried off Highway 17, still under the yellow roses I still brought every first Sunday. I said quietly the last words of the first chapter. They said I was a confused old woman who forgot her own son. The truth was simpler. My son forgot me. But I kept the receipts. And the receipts, as my grandmother told me on a porch in 1964, are the one thing they cannot take back. The room was very still for a long moment. Then a woman in the back stood up. She was older than me, maybe 75. She had silver braids and a cane and a face that had seen everything I had seen and then some. She began to clap. Then another woman stood. Then another. Then a man. Within 30 seconds, every person in that library was on their feet, and I stood at the podium with my mother's pearls at my throat, and I thought, Grandma Ruthie, look, they let me all the way in.